So does anyone know what metadata is? Just wanted to say, can you put your hands up? I would like to see a show of hands. So who knows what metadata is? Okay, good. Thank God. Because you might have been confused from what George Brandis has said. So anyway, a little over 19 months ago, around the time former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden began helping reveal the extent of questionable mass collection of citizens' data by governments around the world, the term metadata began being used quite a bit in the mainstream media. What was this so-called metadata, I thought, and why were governments the world over trying to get their hands on it? So with this in mind, I decided as a journalist I'd try and gain access to mine to see what all the fuss was about. I thought if the spies could have my metadata without a warrant, which is currently the case in Australia, why couldn't I? So I asked Telstra to hand over any metadata associated with my mobile phone account, quoting the Australian privacy principles, which state that companies with a turnover of more than $3 million need to provide you with access to any personal information they have on file about you. Now, in case you didn't already know, the reason you're able to access this information by law in Australia is so that you can make sure the information is accurate, complete, and up to date. Now, Telstra refused to hand it over, and so I took the matter up with the Australian Privacy Commissioner. Just before a hearing of the matter, before the Commissioner was due to start, which consisted of just me representing myself and Telstra's representatives flown from Melbourne, including their Chief Privacy Officer, an in-house lawyer, a hired barrister, and 2 other senior officials, Telstra decided to hand me about 24 months' worth of my bills in a big physical binder about that thick. It was not my metadata, I explained to them. They also handed me a CD which had more granular information about which cell towers I had connected to. Close to what I wanted, but not enough. What about the unique IP addresses of servers I had connected to, for instance, my web browsing history, or the IP addresses assigned to my mobile phone? Then, a few months later, they handed me even more data on a CD, but not everything they have on me. Again, it was not all of it. The Privacy Commissioner is set to determine the matter soon. In the meantime, I've discovered through the hearing and submissions to the Commissioner that Telstra stores approximately 3,000 terabytes of mobile phone metadata, the same capacity of about 192,000 16-gigabyte iPhones. This allows storage of the metadata of every one of its 16 million mobile subscribers for 30 days. That's just 30 days before it's all purged. New laws passed by the Federal Senate last week require that precise data to be now stored for 2 years for access by a number of Australian law enforcement agencies. And did I mention without a warrant? This data was disclosed more than 500,000 times in the 2012/13 financial year. During my fight for access to my data, Telstra has argued that if my data was taken in isolation, that is, without my name attached to it in a database where it's stored, it wouldn't identify me. This argument is flawed though, because if I sought access through Telstra, the information is not being judged in isolation. It is clearly in the context of my account with Telstra. Secondly, if you were to troll through this data, you would be able to discern who I was, even if my identity wasn't attached. As an example of this, in August 2006, then popular search engine AOL released what it thought was anonymised search query logs conducted by a large number of its users. The release was intentional and intended for research purposes. However, the public release meant that the entire internet could see the results rather than a select number of academics. Through clues revealed in the search queries, the New York Times successfully uncovered the identities of several people who used the AOL search engine, revealing what they had searched for online. With one user's permission, the New York Times exposed user 4417749 as Thelma Arnold, a 62-year-old widow from Georgia in the US. Thelma conducted hundreds of searches over a 3-month period on topics ranging from numb fingers to 60 single men to dog that urinates on everything. Search by search, click by click, the identity of AOL user number 4417749 became easier to discern. There were queries for landscapers in Limburn, Georgia, searches for several people with the last name Arnold, and searches for homes sold in Shadow Lake subdivision, Gwinnett County, Georgia. Arnold also frequently researched her friend's medical ailments on AOL. It did not take much investigating to follow the data trail that Thelma Arnold left behind to be able to identify her. Now, while no web browsing history is stored under the metadata proposal, a similar trawl through my phone numbers dialed or the numbers of calls received, if stored, which I understand they are for an unknown period of time at the moment, could also reveal my identity, even if my name wasn't attached to each record in its raw format, I argued to Telstra and the Privacy Commissioner. Now, I wasn't the first person in the world to attempt to get access to my data. And in case you're wondering why I did, I'll get to that shortly. It was German politician Molt Spitz who was the first. Now, the reason that Mr. Spitz sought his data was because the European Union, of which Germany is a member of course, has the Data Retention Directive, which came into effect on May 3, 2006. The directive required telecommunication companies in EU member states, such as Germany, to mandatorily store certain customer data for 6 months for access by law enforcement agencies. To gain access to his data, Mr. Spitz sued German telco giant Deutsche Telekom to hand over 6 months' worth of data generated by his mobile phone that he then made available to a newspaper. The newspaper then combined this data with information relating to his life as a politician, such as Twitter feeds and blog entries, all of which was freely available on the internet. It then published it online and overlaid the location data on top of a Google map, allowing people to set off on a minute-by-minute trip through Mr. Spitz's life using the electronic trail that he had left behind. So for the first time, Germans were able to see a visual picture of exactly what metadata was. No confusing Sky News interview with George Brandis trying to explain it and no idea what's going on. It was every cell tower Mr. Spitz connected to and every email and call he sent and received and much more. It wasn't just or only metadata, it was a complete index of his life. This is precisely why I wanted to do the same thing. Silly analogies like describing metadata as what is on the outside of an envelope and not the letter on the inside, which politicians love to use to calm the nerves, should not be used. The EU directive was overturned, however, on April 8 last year, with the Court of Justice of the European Union declaring it invalid for violating fundamental rights in response to a case brought by a group called Digital Rights Ireland, which represented citizens. The ruling meant that telcos could stop storing the data. But this didn't stop EU member state Britain rushing through emergency laws that forced telcos to keep the data again. It also hasn't stopped Australia from implementing a very similar regime. As I said earlier, every year in Australia there are over 500,000 disclosures of this metadata to a wide variety of agencies, including the Australian Federal Police, State Police, Australia Post, the Tax Office, local councils, Centrelink, the RSPCA, and so on in the enforcement of the law. I think Bankstown Council has even had a go at it. All that is needed to hand over such data is an authorisation by a senior officer. About 2,500 officials across the country have the authorisation to sign off. There is no judicial oversight. The recently passed Australian Data Retention Scheme has actually introduced a number of good safeguards though. For example, the RSPCA, local councils and other non-traditional policing agencies are now no longer able to access the data. Goodbye Bankstown Council. But the 2-year storage of every citizen's data has not been justified in my view. Why can't it be 6 or 12 months? Why 2 years? Also of concern is the risk the data will turn into a big honeypot for hackers. Now that they know the data is being stored, they're going to go after the telcos. They will become a target. And considering the Privacy Commissioner has pointed out that telcos are the worst industry in Australia when it comes to protecting customer data, is not a good thing. While the government's data retention scheme requires telcos to encrypt data stored, many telcos are now beginning to raise concerns about how practical this is going to be, as many legacy technology systems they use do not actually support encryption. Then there's the cost, up to $320 million, of which the government won't say how much it will contribute. But either way, Australians will pay through higher taxes or higher internet bills. What's more concerning is the fact we don't have a Bill of Rights or any human rights protections for that matter in Australia, meaning it can't be challenged on human rights grounds like it has been elsewhere. And why are we having this scheme introduced in the first place? The government argues policing agencies will go, and I've heard this, literally blind. I'm not sure how that's possible if they don't have the data stored. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has said that there will be an explosion in unresolved crime if the scheme wasn't implemented. But a German Parliament study concluded data retention in Germany had led to an increase in the crime clearance rate of 0.006%. A lot of zeros, if you ask me. The government argues a warrant process should not be required as there are so many disclosures of this data every day that it would clog the courts. It's not very reassuring that there are so many disclosures in the first place. I tend to agree, but I still think that there should be at least an independent authority that gives the okay for each request. It doesn't have to be a judge. As Human Rights Commissioner Gillian Triggs recently remarked, and I quote, "It is unconvincing to suggest that you should have a warrant for content, but no warrant for metadata, especially when there appears anecdotally to be evidence that metadata can be even more intrusive than the content itself." I think a former NSA director said we kill people based on metadata. Having all our metadata stored is also likely to threaten freedom of speech, with people fearful of the fact that there is a possibility of them being monitored. In conclusion, there are many privacy issues with metadata retention and we don't have enough safeguards. Police should be able to access this data. I absolutely agree with that. I don't think that they shouldn't. But the existing safeguards and the new ones don't go far enough in protecting us, as demonstrated by the Queensland Police. And I think I've skipped a page or two, so I'll ad-lib here. So in Queensland, senior Queensland Police officials went after, through metadata, existing access to metadata, the call charge records of young cadets to figure out whether they were, one, sleeping with one another, slacking off on the job, or faking sick days. And that just shows you that this has in the past been abused and it will continue to be abused in the future. How do we know that there aren't more cases like this that we just don't know about? And back to my metadata battle, I've also made, it seems, a bit of progress. Just a couple of weeks ago, Telstra announced it would make available some of their customers' metadata starting from Wednesday this week for a $25 fee. You won't be able to see everything law enforcement sees, like who calls you, which would be useful if trying to track down those pesky telemarketers. But it is a significant improvement on the limited information they are offering today via bills. If you want to see what your metadata looks like, give it a shot. Lastly, I thought I'd touch on the journalists and access to their metadata. I kind of agree that the media has been having a bit of a cry over those issues. I just wish that they cared more about the whole entire Australian population having access, the agencies having access, warrantless access to their metadata, the citizens who they're meant to represent, rather than just, please don't look at my sources, please don't look at my metadata. Anyway, that's me. If you have any questions, go for it.